Hello, everyone. This talk is part of the Stockton Symphony Insights lecture series, and it was given in preparation for the Classics 2 concert that the symphony put up in the 2017-2018 season. The concert was held on 11/18/2017. The subject of the talk is Beethoven Symphony No. 4, which was performed by the symphony on that date. I have a detailed 12-page handout about Beethoven's Fourth, which can be accessed or downloaded via my website. The website address is morrissenegor.com. That's with one R, MORISSENEGOR.com. And if you go to the Music tab, you'll find both the handout for this concert or this talk and handouts for other talks from prior Insights lectures. This will be a useful accompaniment to the talk. On we go with Beethoven's Fourth. Beethoven's Symphony No. 4 was premiered in 1807. It is Beethoven's least well-known and least performed symphonies. The problem with the symphony was elegantly stated by the composer Robert Schumann, who, in his own lifetime, was better known as a music critic. Schumann said about Beethoven's No. 4 that it was, quote, a slender Grecian maiden between two Nordic giants, unquote. The two Nordic giants that Schumann was referring to was Beethoven's Third, Eroica, of 1803, and Beethoven's famous Fifth Symphony of 1808. This is indeed a slender symphony. It is in a classical style, and I'll explain that in a minute. And it just simply doesn't sound Beethovenish enough. That's probably why it's not performed very often. Now let's give a little bit of a historical perspective before we discuss the symphony. Beethoven was born into the classical era of Western concert music, which is the era of Haydn and Mozart in particular, the late 1700s. And in his early career as a hotshot concert pianist, he also composed some works that are considered classical. His first two symphonies in particular are considered classical. His Third Symphony, Eroica, breaks with the classical tradition and ushers in the Romantic era. With his Third Symphony, which was probably the longest symphony ever composed up until that time, Beethoven releases the chains of restrained expression and strict adherence to classical musical formulas, and inaugurates a new era of free expression for the composer. This idea of the freedom of expression of the artist sounds like mother's milk to us, but throughout the ages, that was not the norm, and Beethoven's concept was in its time revolutionary. When Beethoven went on to his Fifth Symphony, the other Nordic giant, that was a sound that had never, ever been heard before. It was revolutionary. In between these two, he was commissioned to compose a symphony by a certain Count von Oppersdorff, an aristocratic music nut who offered 500 florins for it. It was a tidy sum, and Beethoven basically composed this for the money. At the time, he was working on his Symphony No. 5 this is 1806, and he broke off from his work on Symphony No. 5 and quickly on the run composed this Symphony No. 4. So Symphony No. 4 was essentially composed simultaneously with Symphony No. 5. Beethoven was a painstaking and slow composer. He took great pains to create and work on his ideas before they turned into his symphonies. And he left a good deal of paperwork behind, things like sketchbooks and so forth, about how these symphonies were composed. Interestingly, there is very little in the way of such documentation regarding the Fourth Symphony. It appears as though he just composed the Fourth Symphony with great ease and without any painstaking preparation. Professor Robert Greenberg, who has a group of lectures that I would, by the way, strongly recommend to anyone who's interested, on Beethoven symphonies in the Great Courses series, has a good theory on why this may be. Beethoven did not need any source material for the Fourth Symphony, according to Professor Greenberg, because he already had the source material in his Fifth Symphony material. Indeed, a lot of scholars have made comparisons between the Fourth and the Fifth and found commonalities. Outwardly, on the surface, these two symphonies have nothing in common, but inwardly they do. This talk is not one about a comparative analysis of the two symphonies, so I'm not going to go into that, but I will give you one example of that in the introduction when we come to it. In any case, Beethoven basically went back to a classical style with the Symphony No. 4 because he needed to produce a quick symphony and it was easier to compose a classical-sounding work. However, be aware that once Eroica came into being and the romantic aesthetic was introduced by this Third Symphony, there was no going back. This symphony may seem classical and Haydnesque, but it is not. In its details, it is still a Romantic era symphony, or maybe, shall we say, a transitional work. The symphony is in 4 movements, as is prescribed by the classical formula, and it follows the same progression of movements that you would expect from a classical era symphony. The first movement is in sonata allegro form, or sonata form, with a slow introduction. The second movement is a slow movement. The third movement is a stylized dance. In the classical era, it used to be called minuet and trio, and in Beethoven's era, it came to be called Scherzo. And in this third movement, Beethoven breaks new ground. And the last movement is a blisteringly fast sonata form movement with much energy and humor. The symphony is in the key of B-flat major, a relatively upbeat key, and it can be described as ebullient or joyful. However, you would not know this if you listened to the introduction, the very beginning of the symphony. Let's examine this introduction in some detail. The introduction is a slow, hushed, mysterious, somewhat ominous music, and it's ambiguous in its key area. It sets up an expectation of tension and suspense, which Beethoven will then wipe out soon enough when it unexpectedly transitions into a lively and energetic music. The introduction is in 3 parts, and the first musical example we will examine is the Part 1 and the very beginning of Part 2. The music starts with a quiet, mysterious mood set by a pedal in winds and horns. A pedal is a sustained note. The reason it's called a pedal is because you achieve this in the pipe organ by pressing a pedal. There's a pedal for each note. Pedal harmonies create static music. The music doesn't seem to go anywhere, and the hushed tone of the music, on top of which some melodies will appear, gives the music its mysterious mood. On top of the pedal, we will then hear the strings play a slow pianissimo melody, which is made of a descending line of thirds. Each note is separated by 3 piano keys from each other, thirds. The key is an unexpected key of B-flat minor. After this, we'll hear strings play a stepwise falling melody that sounds like sneaky footsteps, then a two-note conversation between strings and winds, and the first part ends, and the pedal starts again, beginning the second part. Let's go ahead and hear the music. Here's the pedal. And the descending melody. And now the sneaky footsteps. End of part one, pedal that begins part two. Now this B-flat minor beginning is completely unexpected, and it would have been jolting to Beethoven's contemporaries. It would be akin to us going to a movie theater to see, let's say, an action-adventure or maybe a romantic comedy, and instead encountering a brooding, depressing Swedish movie. We would wonder if we were in the correct movie theater. This has the same effect. Let me also mention that this type of an introduction, a slow, mysterious introduction to what's going to end up being an ebullient piece, is not a new idea for Beethoven. It had been done before by Haydn on several occasions, most recently with the Symphony No. 103 of 1795. That symphony of Haydn's begins with a long drum roll followed by a slow, solemn, and mysterious introduction. Haydn was at one time Beethoven's teacher, and Beethoven would have been aware of this symphony. In fact, Haydn was alive in 1806 and 1807 when Symphony No. 4 came to being, although he was retired. In any case, as with much of Beethoven's work, this introduction became inspirational down the century, down the 1800s, and many composers were inspired by this introduction to do theirs in a similar way. These include Weber with his Der Freischütz, an opera, Mahler with his Symphony No. 1, Richard Strauss with his famous Also Sprach Zarathustra, and Stravinsky with his ballet suite, Firebird. I want to play you Mahler's Symphony No. 1 and the remarkable similarity of Mahler's introduction to his first symphony with Beethoven's fourth. So the first musical example will be what you just heard, the beginning of part one of the introduction, and then we'll go straight into Mahler and we'll listen to that. Here's Beethoven again. And now, Mahler's first. Now, you might wonder if Beethoven or his estate, not that he has one, should sue Mahler for copyright infringement. Well, in those days, intellectual property was not what it is now. This sort of gesture was considered homage by the young composer towards the great Beethoven. It was not considered stealing, but rather an honor. The introduction continues on with a part 2 that sounds very similar to part 1, except that it moves towards the key of G, and then a part 3 where the pedal begins for the third time, but then the music becomes transitional and anticipatory and transitions into theme 1 of the sonata form movement. So we will be transitioning from this rather hushed, mysterious sound to something that's much more energetic. The way Beethoven does this is with 2 loud fortissimo tutti chords. Tutti means the entire orchestra, each one of which is followed by a loud arpeggio. An arpeggio is a chord whose notes are played, rather than simultaneously, are played consecutively. So it'll sound something like bum, a loud chord, prum, the arpeggio, and then it will repeat bum, prum, and it just cuts through the entire mysterious mood. Then we will hear 5 more loud arpeggios in rapidly accelerating sequence. The music is gaining energy. It's as though a shot-put hurler is hurling the music forth. So let's listen to the next example where we pick it up from the end of the introduction, part 3, with this transitional music and into these 2 loud chords, the arpeggios, and then the hurling arpeggios into the newly found energy, B-flat major, of the first theme of the first movement. Transitional music. First loud tutti chord. Another one. Off we go. All right. The first movement proper is in sonata form. Sonata form has certain events that happen predictably, within which an infinite variety of music can be composed. The sequence of events in the sonata form begins with an exposition where the themes are stated, and it's followed by a development section where these themes are broken down and subjected to musical variation. The next event is recapitulation, where these themes return, usually all in the home key, and finally a coda, a piece of concluding music. So we will examine the exposition in great detail, and if you can understand the exposition, you will understand the rest of the movement. The classical era formula prescribed that the exposition have 2 main themes. A first theme in the home key, in this case it would be B-flat major, and a second theme in another key, usually in the dominant of the home key. In this case, it would be F major. First themes in the classical era were sort of martial, assertive, quote-unquote masculine, if you will, to be politically incorrect. Second themes tend to be lyrical, lilting, quote-unquote feminine, if you will. The themes in the classical era were usually tunes. They could be a 4-square melody or an extended melody, but was basically a melody. Then there is a closing section, often with a closing theme as well, that ends the exposition. Now, in this exposition, we do have a theme 1, theme 2, and a closing section with a closing theme, but the themes are not single melodies. They are theme complexes. Theme complexes are, again, more of a Romantic era phenomenon than a classical era phenomenon. You won't see theme complexes in Mozart. Theme 1 has a phrase A. It is a rising martial idea in strings. Then it has a phrase B, which is a lilting lyrical response in winds. So the theme combines both quote-unquote masculine and quote-unquote feminine elements in it. And then there's an extension of the theme into a theme complex. So let me just play you phrase A and phrase B first, and then we'll hear the entire theme 1 complex. Phrase A. Phrase B. And now the entire theme 1 complex, which will include what you just heard, theme 1, phrase A and B. First one loud in strings, second one lilting in winds, and then a more assertive version of A and B, both loud and assertive. Then it's followed by an interlude and a climax on phrase A. Let's go ahead and hear it. As you can see, this is not just a simple tune, but rather a complex that explores particularly phrase A at some length. Now, this will be followed by what's called a modulating bridge, a piece of bridge music that will connect theme 1 to theme 2. The word modulation means key change. We're going to go from B flat major to F major, and modulating music will sound like it's moving someplace. Modulating music where there's a rapid key change, sounds like it's moving, as opposed to that pedal you heard at the very beginning of the introduction, static music with harmonies that don't change. The modulating bridge in this exposition is very brief, and I'm going to play it to you when we play the entire exposition. Let's now explore Theme 2. Theme 2 is in 3 parts, and once again, there are lilting lyrical elements as well as more assertive elements. So, Theme 2 Part 1 is a rustic tune that begins in canon, in bassoon, then oboe, then flute, and is extended in strings. The word canon means like row, row, row your boat. Bassoon starts, oboe comes in before bassoon finishes, and so forth. So let's hear Theme 2 Part 1. Theme 2 Part 2 is loud and assertive. It's a crescendo that's derived from the modulating bridge. Let's hear that section. Finally, the third part of the Theme 2 complex is another lyrical sweet tune that Beethoven labels dolce in the score. Dolce, by the way, play it sweetly, is one of Beethoven's favorite instructions in his scores. This is a tune in clarinet and bassoon, and then it's more assertively restated tutti. Tutti again, the whole orchestra. Let's hear this one. Finally, there's a closing theme that's at the end of the closing material, and let's hear this. It's derived from phrase A. Now we will hear the entire exposition, beginning with those 2 loud tutti chords and arpeggios, and then the 5 hurling arpeggios, and then the entire exposition. And I will voice over the various sections of the exposition so we can put all this together. Theme 1. Theme 1 repeated. The extension within the theme 1 complex. Crescendo and climax on theme A. Modulating bridge. Theme 2, first section. Theme 2, second section. Theme 2, third section. Closing material. Closing theme. Now, in a lot of classical era music, and also quite a bit of romantic era music, not all, the various sections of a sonata form movement are demarcated by the composer with some musical device. It could be a pause, it could be a repeating musical element, and so forth. And Beethoven certainly does that in many of his symphonies as well. But in this symphony, you will not find devices that cue you in to the end of the exposition, beginning of development, etc. The reason for that is because Beethoven is mainly concerned with momentum. Momentum is of prime importance here. So the lines are a little blurred between, let's say, exposition and development. But before we go to development, let me make another point. In the classical era, expositions in sonata form movements were repeated. And Beethoven, in all of his symphonies, asks for exposition repeats in his sonata form movements. Whether or not an exposition repeat is actually stated in concert is up to the individual conductor. Peter Jaffe, the conductor of the Stockton Symphony, rarely takes exposition repeats. So the Stockton Symphony version of this music will not feature an exposition repeat in this one or in the fourth movement. However, depending upon what recording of the symphony you're listening to, you may or may not have an exposition repeat. Just be aware of that. Now, moving on to the development, classical era development sections were relatively small, whereas late Romantic era developments in the late 1800s were big, elaborate affairs. Here, we have a relatively short development section that explores, again, mostly theme 1. If you understood the theme 1 of the exposition, the development is fairly easy to follow. The only part I'm going to play you is the end of the development and the transition into recapitulation. Now, recapitulation in a sonata form movement is the dramatic high point of the narrative. And oftentimes, recapitulations are jubilatory events. Most composers write recapitulations as a celebratory kind of situation, a loud return into recapitulation, or something like that. Here we have a rather quiet and interesting, unusual end of development and recapitulation. In some ways, this transition from development to recapitulation mimics the introduction, but not in that negative mood. So we will hear again the equivalent of those two loud tutti chords in the arpeggios, but they're going to come in kind of soft. There will be some transitional music, and once again the chords and the arpeggios. And notice that there will be tympani beats in there, soft tympani beats. And actually the tympani will beat the recapitulation before theme 1 returns with a shorter version of that hurling music you heard, and then a truncated version of theme 1. We will not play the whole truncated version of theme 1, just this remarkable transition, rather quiet end of development, and the tympani beats, and then the recapitulation by the orchestra. Here's that arpeggio, and listen to the drum rolls. Transitional music. Once again, chord and arpeggio. Tympani rolls. Beethoven is the first composer that treated the tympani with some respect as a respectable musical instrument and not just a drum to be beat upon. So here, these tympani rolls are actually anticipating recapitulation before the melodic recapitulation occurs. A lot of musical scholars love this transition into recapitulation, and they think that it's quite nifty. Now, as I indicated earlier, the recapitulation features a truncated version of theme 1, and that's unusual. In the classical era, recapitulations exactly mimicked in expositions, except that everything came back in the home key. In this case, it'll be B flat major. Beethoven changes that and truncates theme 1 because he's given us a pretty large dose of theme 1 already. We heard quite a bit of it in that theme 1 complex, and we certainly heard quite a bit of it in the development. So he doesn't feel like repeating it all over again in recapitulation. This concept of varying the theme in its later versions will be taken to an extreme by the end of the century, and by the time we come to Mahler, composing at the end of the century, any verbatim repetition will be considered lazy and inferior. But here we see the beginnings of that, another feature of the Romantic era, in this truncated theme 1 in recapitulation. The theme 2 and closing section of the recapitulation is exactly the same pretty much, except for the key change, as the exposition. I will finally play you the coda of the first movement. Beethoven is very well known, quite famous for his extended codas that are virtually second development sections. Here, we don't get that. We get a true classical coda, a relatively brief piece of music that recalls what's been already stated and then gives it a little finishing touch. So let's hear this coda, which will feature theme 1, phrases A and B, and then some concluding music. One feels like applauding at this point, and nowadays applause between movements is not allowed, but in Beethoven's time it certainly was, and if an audience wanted a repetition of the movement, they would get it. There were no recordings. It would be the only occasion where they would hear this music. The lack of applause after movements actually begins with Mahler, way down later in the century. Peter Jaffe, the Stockton Symphony conductor, will allow the audience to applaud if they want to. Now let's move on to the second movement. This is the slow movement, and its structure is somewhat confusing and controversial. Different musical scholars label the structure differently. Some think it's a rondo, others think that it's a variation of sonata form. It certainly begins as though it's sonata form in that it has a proper exposition with a theme 1, theme 2, and a closing section. What happens after that is the matter of conjecture. So let me go with theme 1 and theme 2 first, put it in your ears, and then we'll talk some more. Theme 1 is a beautiful aria-like cantabile melody. Cantabile, again, is the mark that Beethoven puts in the score. It's an achingly beautiful melody, which unfolds leisurely in the strings. But before we hear that, we will hear an ostinato. And an ostinato is a recurring musical figure, often in accompaniment. So this ostinato is a two-note idea, and it sounds like this: pum, pa-pum, pa-pum, pa-pum. This rhythm, pum, pa-pum, 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 will be all over the second movement, mostly in accompaniment, but at times it will rise to the surface and it will climax. So we hear this beautiful melody, theme 1, initially starting with the ostinato and then the theme 1 music, the beautiful melody, the ostinato in accompaniment, and then the ostinato will rise into a climax, and then theme 1 will repeat in variation. Let's hear it. That's the ostinato and the theme 1 melody. Notice that the ostinato is there in accompaniment. And a climax on the ostinato. New variation on theme 1. This theme was in the key of E-flat major, which is the key of the second movement. Theme 2 is in B-flat major and again follows the classical prescription in terms of the harmonic area. It is another sweet melody in clarinet, in conversation with strings, and it climaxes into a closed cadence. A closed cadence is essentially a punctuation mark, the equivalent of a period. You can clearly hear, for once, where a certain section ends. Let's hear theme 2. Here's the clarinet. And the strings conversing with the clarinet. This is followed by a closing section that I'm not playing for you for lack of time. After the proper end of the exposition, in a sonata form movement, we expect development. We expect these themes to be broken down into their different parts and subjected to musical variation. Instead, what we get next is a repetition of theme 1. It's in a variation, it's an ornamented variation, but it comes back in E-flat major, and it sounds like maybe a recapitulation is taking place without development. At least that's the way Peter Jaffe interprets it. Others consider this the beginning of development and the variation of the theme 1 as being a sort of development. In any case, I'm going to play you this theme 1, which again is a beautiful melody. By this time, we're just sort of in love. You know, it's just these gorgeous melodies. But what happens after the theme 1 variation ends is rather jolting. Let's listen to it, and then we'll talk about it. Here's theme 1 in variation. Here's the climax on the ostinato. And now a new section. And thank God we're out of that. One wants to say, whoa, what happened there? All of a sudden, emotionally, the bottom fell out. What happened was that we went from E-flat major to E-flat minor, and we got this amazing angst-ridden, anguished music in the midst of lovelorn music. This is a famous episode in the symphony, and it represents, along with the introduction, the two dark moods of the symphony. What does this all mean? The musicologist Simpson had, I think, an explanation that I like the most about this. Simpson says, the symphony is nowadays described as purely joyous. Then he points out that it's not truly so because there are these two bleak moments in the symphony, the introduction and what you just heard in the second movement. He then goes on to say, joy it expresses in abundance, but its point surely is that light is no longer light when darkness is inconceivable. His point is that you're not going to appreciate the good times in life unless you experience a little bit of bad. So I think these two negative sections, or bleak sections of the symphony, are in some ways a metaphor for life. Now, the remainder of the development continues to explore mainly theme 1, and then the recapitulation mirrors the exposition. The one area I want to play you an example of is the very end of this movement, the coda, and once again here the tympani is featured prominently. In this later section of the coda, we will hear theme 1 restated in winds, followed by a quiet passage in horns, strings, and winds on a motive from the closing theme that we did not hear. There's a crescendo and a climax, and then we'll hear the solo tympani beating the ostinato. And we wonder whether this movement, beautiful as it was, will just disappear into ether, as many such second movements do in the Romantic era. But it doesn't. It has another climax, and it goes out majestically. Let's hear it. Tympani beats out the ostinato. Beautiful. Just as in the first movement recapitulation, Beethoven once again assigned the timpani a dramatic role. Timpanists love Beethoven. The role of the timpani, incidentally, will increase as we go along in Beethoven's work, and there will be a lot for the timpanist to do in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Now we'll move on to the third movement. Classical era third movements were stylized dances, minuet, trio, and minuet. The return of the minuet, also known as da capo, back to the beginning or back to the head, was usually somewhat truncated. The minuet was a dance created for the great Sun King of France, Louis XIV. He was a rather corpulent guy, and he couldn't really dance anything more than just maybe something rather slow. It was a triple meter dance. Beethoven destroyed the minuet early in his career. By his Second Symphony, he created a third movement that did not sound like a minuet anymore, and he called this his joke on the minuet, the word joke in Italian being scherzo. Well, Beethoven's joke was taken seriously, and from then on, in the Romantic era, third movements came to be known as scherzo. In his Fourth Symphony, Beethoven again composes music that sounds nothing like a minuet, music that King Louis XIV could never have danced to, quite rhythmic, and the beat changes, the emphasis changes. The trio section of minuet and trio movement involves a lowly instrumented section. It's never three instruments, but lowly instrumented contrasting music. So typically it would be A, minuet, B, trio, and then back to A. Now, for the first time in music history, Beethoven changes this sequence and he creates an A-B-A, B-A movement. So he extends his scherzo and makes it longer. This, again, is a tradition which will start with the Fourth Symphony and will be adopted both by Beethoven himself, in his Seventh Symphony in particular, and by other composers that came down the line. So let's listen to the Scherzo. It is a jagged upward melody in orchestra, followed by rising and falling scales in strings and winds, and it ends in a climax. I call the first version of the Scherzo A, so let's listen to that first. In the first presentation of the Scherzo, this A section will be heard twice. After that, we get an A prime. It's a much more elaborate, extended version of the Scherzo, where Beethoven explores some developmental potential of this music. So let's hear A prime. As you can hear, it ends with a rather lengthy climax. Now, in the first presentation of the Scherzo, A and A prime both appear twice. When the scherzo comes back, they will appear once. So the return of the scherzo will be truncated, and then when it comes back the third time, the true da capo, it'll be even further truncated. So once again, Beethoven is doing the same thing that he did with the first movement, where he presented theme 1 in an extended version in the beginning and truncated it later, because he doesn't want to bore his audience with repetition. The trio is a contrasting piece of music. You will hear it twice in this movement, and it will be repeated verbatim. The trio is a rustic melody, and it's redolent of these country bands that Beethoven often listened to when he went to the countryside, and Beethoven loved to go to the countryside. So these are kind of rough bands. They're not musicians of the same caliber as those in court orchestras in Vienna or other major European cities, and they're limited in their potential. There's a comic element in this as well, where there's a violinist that has a very limited range, a fiddler. Maybe it's a kid that just wants to join the orchestra with his fiddle, and all you hear are these 3 notes. He's of very limited capability, and it truly sounds comic. Let's hear the trio. And here's the fiddle. Once again. The fourth movement is a lively, fast movement with rhythmic momentum and many soft and loud juxtapositions. Once again, there's not too much in the way of demarcation between the various sections of the movement. It has an exposition, development, recapitulation, and coda, but it's hard to hear. Not only that, but it's hard to hear much in the way of tunes in this movement. Now, we could dissect the exposition into its various elements, and I did do that, but I don't think it's worth doing it because it's not worth listening to it that way. The movement is really concerned with fast momentum, and you need to hear it for the effect it creates as a whole. So the main idea in this movement, in the exposition, is a chattering melody of 16th notes, mainly in the strings, and it moves fast. There's a lot of soft and loud juxtapositions, and amid all this chatter, there's a few rare tunes, and when the tunes occur, you actually hear them. So one of them is a dance-like melody in strings that will be part of the theme 1 complex. The other one is the second theme. So again, there's a theme 1 complex, there's a modulating bridge, there's a second theme, and there's closing material, but there's hardly any demarcation between these, and it's not worth identifying them. We'll just listen to the piece, the entire exposition. It's relatively brief, and appreciate the energy and the momentum and these soft, loud juxtapositions. Let's go ahead. This is theme 1. All this chatter and a tune from the theme 1 complex. Theme 2. can certainly appreciate the energy and the momentum of this piece. Now, what is this all about? The next two musical examples and the interpretation of this is something I borrowed from Professor Robert Greenberg. It's a nifty idea. I'm going to play you a little bit of the exposition that you already heard. It's part of the modulating bridge. And then I'm going to play you a different piece of music from a different composer. See if you can guess who this other composer is, and then we'll talk about it. Let's hear that first, the Beethoven example, and then the other composer. And now the other one. Did you guess who that other composer was? It was Mozart. That music was from The Marriage of Figaro, an opera buffa, a comic opera. So it certainly sounds very similar to the music we hear in this movement. So Professor Greenberg's interpretation of this movement is that it's opera buffa. You're not supposed to take all these haughty, loud sections seriously. And indeed, as the movement progresses, you hear some rather pompous, loud sections that seem to anticipate serious music, and then it doesn't happen. It's all buffoonery. So let me give you some examples of this, and you'll notice that some of them are rather humorous. Here's the first example, and from the development section, development part 1 going into part 2. We hear the chattering strings that lead to a crescendo and a massive fortissimo climax on a unison B note. What then follows is a rather mousy, awkward fall into the quiet, tuneful version of theme 1 that we heard in the exposition. Let's hear it. The chattering strings, crescendo, that loud unison climax hangs there awkwardly for a brief time and then disappears into nothing. It's a rather awkward moment, and I think it's meant to be, again, comic. The next one is somewhat more comic, and it comes from the end of development and transition into recapitulation. Here, once again, we have the chattering strings leading to another crescendo, and now we get a sustained, lengthy, dramatic fortissimo passage that sounds really stormy. But it ends suddenly with some sudden quiet, and then a solo bassoon begins the recapitulation, a return to theme 1. It's as though the bassoonist lost his place and just sort of jumped the gun and started before the rest of the orchestra, and then the orchestra explodes with theme 1 following the bassoon. Now, bassoons are rather funny instruments. They make a funny sound, and the appearance of a solo bassoon after such a sustained dramatic passage, again, is comic and is reminiscent of comic opera. Let's hear this example. Chattering strings, crescendo, stormy passage, and the bassoon. Beethoven reserves his most humorous moment to the very end of the movement, the very end of the symphony. Here, we will hear in the end of the coda the tuneful melody of theme 1 that goes on to a dissonant climax and a tutti chord. Then there will be a pause and another tutti chord and another pause. The music seems to anticipate something pretty serious. But by now, we're on to Beethoven, and we know nothing serious will happen. Instead, what we get is this quiet, listless, tired theme 1 in strings and then in bassoon. It's as though the musicians are saying, enough already. We're tired. We're really tired. This was a fast movement. We're tired of it. We want out. We want to finish. And it, for a moment, feels like the music is going to go out with a whimper. But in one last fit of energy, in a Herculean effort, the orchestra recovers enough energy to go out with a brief bang. Let's hear it. Theme 1 melody. The climax. Oh, we're so tired. It's a Haydnesque, humorous moment. Beethoven's Symphony No. 4, had it been composed by any other contemporary composer in Beethoven's time, would have been considered a crowning achievement of that composer's career. The musicologist Keller makes this point by saying that if it had been composed by anyone other than Beethoven, quote, say by Clementi or Dussek, it would be exalted as a supreme achievement of orchestral writing, towering above anything else in their catalogues, unquote. Unfortunately for Beethoven's Symphony No. 4, it is in much more exalted company in Beethoven's subsequent symphonies and the third that preceded it, and it doesn't get enough playtime. However, it deserves some attention. I would strongly encourage you to look up this symphony and listen to it on your own. Thank you very much.